and in particular to Bill Bender, who is a board member, for facilitating Leidos's sponsorship of this series, and to Tom Frana of Vion for, again, supporting the series. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Vice Admiral Fritz Rogi, the 16th President of the National Defense University, for some opening remarks. Admiral Rogi, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, James, for that kind introduction and for hosting today's webinar. This is the NDU Foundation's 9th National Security Briefing webcast, and of course, it's a pleasure for me to be here with you today. It's through these kinds of dynamic discussions with world-renowned leaders such as Secretary Mabus that we gain valuable new perspectives on the national and important global security issues. The Foundation's virtual webcasts have included participants from over 35 international allied countries, as well as NDU students, faculty, alumni, government civilians, military, private sector, as you heard James Reed just allude to. And we all come here together as partners to engage and gain insights on points of view that are essential to NDU's education mission of national security. The NDU Foundation is one of the university's most important partners, and their sponsorship of webinars like this is but one small aspect of that support. But in reality, every one of you here today is one of our partners because of our shared interest in the security of our nation. Now, it is NDU's mission to prepare today's rising national security professionals to become that next generation of decision makers and senior leaders across military, government, and industry, the leaders our nation will depend upon tomorrow. And I see we have some participants who are new to this series, so let me just offer a quick word to describe and tell you about your National Defense University. I'm certain that this crowd appreciates that we live in an increasingly complex, dynamic, and uncertain world. We face many competitors and threats to our security. And to counter these threats, America requires leaders who can outthink our adversaries and the challenges we face today and in the future. Because while the technological superiority that America has long enjoyed is important, it is insufficient to deliver the warfighting advantage that our nation's security demands and that our service members deserve. In fact, competitors are investing heavily to try to erode our technical advantages, and therefore it's imperative that NDU be able to create intellectual advantage. Our students are in equal parts military members of the U.S. Armed Services, civilians from across the U.S. government, and this year we have 120 international students from 65 friendly, partnered, and allied nations. And if we do well at our education mission, then these students will graduate with the ability to launch the kinds of ideas that could preclude the need to launch weapons. And that's a positive effect that reaches far beyond the classroom and beyond graduation day, because the ways in which the U.S. and its partners work together on common security challenges are ways that are increasingly joint and interagency and international. So the relationships that are built in our classrooms translate directly into the relationships that serve our common security interests. And so the lasting measure of our success is in the peace and security enjoyed by the United States and our partners and allies. In the words of former Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, education is quite simply peace building by another name. It is the most effective form of defense spending there is. So let me then suggest that if you would want the leaders of your national security enterprise, key decision makers contributing to your peace and security, if you would want them ideally to be well educated in how to do so, then you should not only be partners of NDU, but our advocates. And I hope that will encourage you all to learn more about the University of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, your National Defense University. And on behalf of NDU, it is my distinct honor to introduce our distinguished speaker today, Secretary Ray Mabus, who has served as a service secretary, a governor, an ambassador, and a chief executive officer. Early in his career, he was the youngest governor ever elected to the state of Mississippi in 150 years. He then served as U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia and chaired 2 major companies before being appointed as the 75th Secretary of the Navy in 2009. Throughout his tenure, Secretary Mabus focused on 4 key priorities: people, platforms, power, and partnerships. And those priorities enable the Navy and Marine Corps' unique ability to maintain the global presence that reassures our allies and deters our adversaries. Secretary Mabus is credited with building a more sustainable, inclusive, and mobilized Navy and Marine Corps. He revolutionized the Navy and Marine Corps personnel systems, opening all jobs to women aggressively moving to alternative energy as a war-fighting measure, building more than twice as many ships during his term than in the preceding 8 years, and was responsible for developing the Gulf Coast Restoration Plan after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. During his tenure, the Navy went from building fewer than 5 ships per year to having more than 70 ships under contract. The Secretary's shipbuilding efforts reversed the decline of the Navy's fleet despite fiscal constraints. And his sustainability efforts successfully and drastically reduced the Navy and Marine Corps dependence on fossil fuels by 50%, which was a goal which was achieved 4 years earlier than its original goal. Secretary Mabus also launched the Navy's Great Green Fleet, a carrier strike group in which all the ships and associated aircraft ran on alternative energy sources, such as nuclear energy and biofuels. And while Secretary of the Navy, he traveled over 1 million miles, visited over 150 countries and territories in all 50 states to meet with sailors and Marines forward deployed or stationed around the world to maintain and develop international relationships and to reconnect the American public with the Navy and Marine Corps, which he appropriately refers to as America's away team. Among his many awards and honors, Secretary Mabus was chosen as one of the top 50 CEOs in America by Glassdoor and was the only government person selected. Perhaps most notably to the sports fans in our crowd, Secretary Mabus is the only naval veteran and Harvard Law School graduate to have thrown out the first pitch at all 30 Major League Baseball parks. Today's topic of climate change and renewable energy and its present and future implications for national security is one of the most pressing and complicated issues of our modern world. And there's no one more eminently qualified to discuss this than our speaker today. Secretary Mabus, it's a pleasure to see you again. Thank you for joining us and thank you for being here today. Over.
Vice Admiral Rogie, thank you so much for that very kind, wonderful introduction. I want to do a very short thumbnail sketch of why I believe that climate change is a vital and even existential national security issue. First and most obvious are our bases. If we don't do something fairly fast, the largest naval base in the world, Norfolk, Virginia, will go underwater, and it will go underwater in the lifetimes of people who are already adults today. So this is not some vague future threat. This is an immediate threat. Even today, king tides are flooding tunnels and roads and keeping sailors from reaching their ships today in Norfolk. And it's not just the Navy and Marines who tend to have bases on shore. Offutt Air Force Base in the middle of the country went underwater because a nearby river flooded. And you're seeing the effects of things like fires on some of our bases. Second, the US military, and particularly the Navy and Marines, are the world's first responders. So as storms get more frequent and stronger, as droughts get more frequent and intense, as floods get more frequent and deeper, the Navy and Marines and the rest of the US Armed Forces are called on increasingly to respond to these humanitarian assistance and disaster reliefs. When things like this happen, when these storms or floods or droughts happen, it often leads to instability. Instability can lead to chaos, and chaos can lead to crisis. And so by not addressing climate change, we're beginning to put our first responders, our service men and women, in harm's way. Third, there's a new ocean opening up, the Arctic. It will be the last new ocean ever to open on the Earth. But as it opens, it offers an opportunity for confrontation and perhaps for conflict. Russia has already said that the waters to its north are internal waters. They're not. They are international waters. The competition for minerals on the seabed floor in the Arctic will become intense and could lead to some unfortunate outcomes. And as more ships travel through the fabled Northwest Passage or across the North Pole itself, you're going to have more search and rescue missions. You're going to have more chances for either accidents or things that that could lead to escalation and to conflict. So, and finally, refugees. When people cannot get enough to eat, when people have no water, when people's homes are flooded or burned, and they begin to leave, to move to where the climate is more hospitable. You're seeing it already in the world. You're seeing these vast flows of refugees, and our military is called on to manage this. And again, it raises grave questions of national security in terms of how we deal with these refugees, which we have to deal with, and we have to deal with in a humane way. Internally, in the US, we already have internally displaced climate refugees, people who have had to flee, people in Louisiana who have had to flee when their homes are flooded forever, people in an island off Maryland who are having to flee, and the government is having to pay for this. But also when storms like Sandy or Katrina hit the US, again, the military are our first responders. So in 2009, as a warfighting measure, as Admiral Rogie mentioned, I came up with goals for the Navy and Marines, the biggest one of which was that by no later than now, 2020, at least half of all naval energy afloat and ashore would come from non-fossil fuel sources. I did that for strategic reasons. You didn't always know who the people you were buying oil and gas from were not always your friends. The notion that in Singapore, we are refueling our ships in the Western Pacific with oil from a Chinese oil refinery, when right down the road is a biofuel refinery owned by the Finns. That's a strategic reason to move, but also for tactical reasons. When I became secretary, we were losing a Marine, killed or wounded, for every 50 fuel convoys brought into Afghanistan. That is just way too high a price to pay. And so by giving Marines solar panels, rollable solar panels that they could put in their packs, it enabled them to do a couple of things. One is it saved a Marine company 700 pounds of batteries that they just didn't have to carry, and they didn't have to be resupplied with. It also allowed them to make energy where they fought. And so now the Marines are very much in the forefront of alternative energy, of powering the things they need to power radios and GPSs, but also heating and cooling and weapon systems and all the things that need power with alternatives. A SEAL commander told me that before they went to using solar and wind, that they used big generators. And he said, you know, when you turn off the generator, you can hear. You can hear when bad people are trying to sneak up on you. And you take a target off your back, because when those generators were running, all folks had to do was, there are the Americans, go attack there. So by the time I left Navy, again, as Admiral Rogie said, 2/3 of all our energy on our bases were coming from non-fossil fuel sources, mainly solar and wind. And we saved $400 million by moving to these. At sea, it's about 40%. We're 17% nuclear, but the rest are biofuels. And these are second and third generation biofuels. These are biofuels that cut way back on carbon emissions. They're biofuels that give farmers a new income source, and they're biofuels that burn cleaner than traditional fuels. And to show how committed I was, I rode in the back seat of an F-18 that went supersonic on 100% biofuels for the first time. And the airplane didn't notice the difference. So the military, as it normally does, can lead in this thing. The Navy was big enough to bring in market. And the Navy has always led in energy transformation, from sail to coal in the 19th century, from coal to oil in the early 20th century, and pioneering the use of nuclear for propulsion in the middle of the 20th century. And every single time that was done, every single time, there were naysayers that said, this will never work. This is a terrible idea. You're trading something that's free, the wind, for something that costs money, coal, or you will never, ever produce a nuclear reactor that's small enough and safe enough to put on a submarine. Every single time, those naysayers were wrong, and they're wrong this time. And so it is time for the military to continue to lead and to move off of fossil fuels for strategic and tactical reasons, and for the purpose of being a good steward for this planet. And finally, you don't have to choose now in the private sector or in government between the bottom line and alternative energy, because now most alternative energy is at least comparable and usually is cheaper than the fossil fuel alternatives. So that's a very brief overview. I'm really looking forward to taking your questions and having a conversation about this.
Thank you, Secretary Mabus. That was very informative. I think that you've touched on so many things that are not necessarily at the forefront of thought across America. And I think that hitting on all of those aspects, whether they're tactical or strategic or economic, as a market maker or as somebody who can create the demand for our farmers and biofuel, that's a really tremendous statement on what the Navy was able to accomplish on its own. And focusing on these in order to bring that transformation that makes a huge difference. I appreciate that. I think also for me, it was a little bit enlightening to think about the fact that this is weight loss, that it is, taking away the weight from the Marines in the field, and their ability to create and generate their own energy is a tactical advantage, and in the long term, a strategic advantage. I think that that's really something that we don't think enough about broadly in the American public, although I suspect that many of our leaders in the National War College and the Eisenhower School think about it a lot, as do the folks who are in CSUC. I think that the pieces here that are very important to me are what led you to this? How did you come to this? And how do we convince others that this is important enough to continue doing, not only in the Navy, but across our services?
The first thing that brought me to this was, as Admiral Rogie pointed out, I was ambassador to Saudi Arabia in the mid-90s, and I saw the power of oil. But I also saw the vulnerabilities of oil. And when I got to Navy, the first 2 years, I was presented with $2 billion in unbudgeted fuel price increases when the price of oil went up in ways that the Pentagon did not expect. And even in the Pentagon, it's tough to find $2 billion that you didn't budget for. And so trying to get a handle on that, and then looking at where we were sourcing these fossil fuels, this oil and gas. And again, a lot of times it was from people who did not have our best interests at heart. So if there was a crisis, if there was something that happened that caused a potential conflict, we could not depend on this. And finally, it was because as the military, we have an obligation to do things that are in the service of our national defense, whether those are strictly military or not. And addressing climate change is one of those huge things that the military has to do, because it's going to have such a big impact, already is, on what the military can and has to do. And so those were the things that brought me to it. I do have to say that when I first started, it was one of those things where you go running over a hill and say, follow me, and you look back and there are not many people behind you. But as the fleet and as sailors and Marines figured out it made them better at their jobs, it got a whole lot of support.
Well, I can't imagine how much nicer it was not to have a generator running right beside you as somebody who maintained generators a little bit in the Air Force at a remote detachment. I think that makes a huge, huge difference. I'd like to remind the audience at this point that we are taking questions via the chat window, so you can type those questions and I'll select from them to ask Secretary Mabus. I think the other pieces that were really interesting to me were that you were focused on the linkage between those national disasters and natural disasters and the instability that they create, whether that is here at home, Louisiana, the fires in California, creating our own climate refugees, or that movement of transnational refugees as a result of climate change and how we have to address that. The Navy's not big enough to change climate by itself. So how do we get those other folks to understand this national security imperative and start focusing on those that have both the economic and that natural disaster emphasis?
Well, the Navy's not big enough by itself, but the Pentagon is pretty big. The Pentagon is the largest user of fossil fuels on Earth. It uses 2% of all fossil fuels produced in the United States every year. And so many times things start in the military and go to the civilian world. Things like the internet and GPS and even flat screen TVs were military projects beforehand. I think that's the first thing. I think that showing that it can work with the military's incredibly strict standards, as they should be. But second is convincing people that it's not a question of doing the right thing or protecting your bottom line. Now you can do both, because alternative energy has become, in the case of solar and wind, far cheaper than even natural gas. And in the case of biofuels, they are reaching parity. In fact, now when the Defense Logistics Agency puts out a request for fuels, they no longer put biofuels on it. It's just fuels. And biofuel companies are now responding and competing to get that fuel. So I think by demonstrating it, by messaging it, by saying that it is a national security issue, it's not just something that's nice to do, or that is, I mean, you don't think of Marines as ardent environmentalists or tree huggers, but they have become on the front lines of utilizing this sorts of energy.
How do you think this impacts great power competition? Are we ahead of or behind our peer and near peer competitors? And how are our allies doing in comparison as well?
I think that that we were doing pretty well until the last 4 years. I think that we are now behind our near peer competitors, particularly China. China is sort of schizophrenic on this. They're building coal plants like crazy, but at the same time, they're spending more on alternatives like solar and wind. And one of the things that we're in danger of is losing the technological advantages that we have with with them. Our allies, I think, are all recognizing the risk here and the danger here, that if we don't begin to move, the last year I was secretary, we had biggest naval exercise in the world every 2 years, Rim of the Pacific. And we had a misnamed oiler that was refueling ships with biofuel, and we refuel the ships from 9 different countries, and all those ships went back. All those countries have begun much more aggressively moving in that direction. So I think we're lagging a little bit now, but I also think that because of our size, because of our technical expertise, because of the scientific expertise of the American people, that we can not only catch up pretty fast, but we can surpass everybody else.
I have a couple of questions from the audience that I'm going to combine. And there's a focus on whether or not the current national security strategy and the national defense strategies leaving out of climate change is an aberration, or is it symptomatic of a larger defense misunderstanding or of our reluctance to address climate change?
Well, climate change first came into the national defense strategy in 2005 under President George W. Bush. It got amplified in 2009 after President Obama was elected. It got further amplified in 2013 during the second QDR, Quadrennial Defense Review, that President Obama presided over. And I think it was universally recognized in the military that this was an issue that the military was going to have to deal with, and it was an issue that was rising in importance from 2004 until 2013. It was headed up the charts in music terms with a bullet. I think that I hope that this is an aberration. I think the military still believes very deeply that they're going to have to deal with climate change, and they're going to have to deal with not just how do we mitigate it, but how do we adapt to it? How can our military perform with climate change, and climate change that is speeding up beyond all previous forecasts? So I do think this is I hope it is an aberration, because it goes against all best military advice. It goes against all best scientific notion, and I will be very careful not to try not to be political here, but it seems to have been taken out for political reasons and not for military, strategic, tactical, or climate change reasons.
So I will leave off that next question that was, where are these headwinds coming from, given that lack of interest in addressing the political aspects of it, and save you that. The next question from the audience is nuclear propulsion for future large surface warfare platforms the future, such as the Future Frigate program and others, or is it biofuels?
Right now it's biofuels. We had nuclear in surface warships, as you know. Our cruisers in the 80s and 90s, some ran on nuclear. With the price of fossil fuels and biofuels so low, you simply cannot make the economic case that smaller surface combatants, cruisers, destroyers, things like that, should be nuclear. We spend more for aircraft carriers and submarines to make them nuclear. They're far more costly than if they were powered by other means, but it gives us such an edge. It gives us such a combat edge. It gives us such a strategic edge to do it. You don't get the same sort of edge with the smaller surface combatants.
Got it. Do you
And I'm
think
perfectly happy to talk about politics. I just, I was trying to be, to be neutral.
Well, I will tell you that the question very specifically is, are the headwinds coming from Congress, the White House, or the military? Where are the strongest objections to adoption of renewables and biofuels coming?
The strongest one's coming from the White House, very clearly, denying that there is climate change, denying that that anything can be attributed to that. Congress has not acted as much as they should, not anywhere close. But I mean, I go back to when I was secretary, when I first started this, you know, took a lot of heat, particularly from Congress, but never enough that they were able to either shut it down or even slow it down. I know that one congressman yelled at me. I mean, literally yelled, said, "You're the Secretary of the Navy. You're not Secretary of Energy. So quit this." And I looked at him and I said, "Yeah, I'm the Secretary of the Navy, and I've got more money than the Secretary of Energy does to do these sorts of things." And as I went through, the Navy has always been on the forefront of climate, of energy change when it is needed. I don't think any of the headwinds are coming from the military, because the military realize that it makes us better war fighters. It makes their job, it makes what they do easier and better.
A question on depoliticization. Try and get that whole word out. Mr. Secretary, climate change and renewable energy are not only issues of science, but in America, they are political issues. Any advice on how to depoliticize the issue?
Well, one of the things that I think can be successful, it certainly was when I was there, is to link it to national security, is to link it, I mean, you can have people that say there's not climate change. You can have people that say we shouldn't do this. There are very few people that say you shouldn't try to save marine lives, that say that it's acceptable for a Marine to be killed or wounded guarding fuel convoys when there's an alternative, when you can give them solar power or wind power, and they don't have to have those fuel convoys. And I think this linkage with national security, that this isn't a do-gooder sort of thing. This isn't a tree hugger sort of issue. This is a mainstream America issue. This is a mainstream military issue. This is an issue that affects our military in the way that we can fight and in the way that we can win. And it affects every single American, and it affects every single person that lives on this planet. And so, and you see in polls that the American people and the people of the world understand what is happening now, and they want some pretty dramatic interventions, and we're going to have to be pretty dramatic because the timeline is speeding up. We used to think that we had decades. Now it's measured perhaps in years.
Another question from the audience. Climate change consequences are inherently collective. How do you balance this with the strategic advantages of adopting alternative energies before, better, or instead of our competition?
Well, I think I understand that question. The second part of it is if we move to these in front of our competition, I think it gives us both a strategic and a tactical advantage. We saw it in nuclear. We were the first movers on nuclear for propulsion, and it took other countries a long time to catch up, and they really haven't caught up yet to our technology in that area. And anything that gives us a tactical or strategic edge, I think is worth doing. You one of the phrases I had when I was secretary was I never wanted to send sailors or Marines into a fair fight. I wanted to make sure that we had advantages that our competitors, that our potential adversaries did not.
One of our students apologized for having to leave because class was starting, but he'll look at the recording. And very specifically said, I appreciated your insight on unit level and operational level activities. That was insight I had not heard before. And for me, it was the same. It was not something that I had heard or thought about before. And I think we're seeing that with innovative new technologies, whether those are drones and surveillance or these renewable energy sources or portable energy sources. How do we make sure that people really understand that tactical advantage and see it as something that is really helpful to the force?
Well, I know when I was in politics that one of the things I thought was important was how does this affect individuals? How does this affect just everybody? And the tactical stuff of Marines, not having to carry batteries and not losing Marines. But I also set up a thing, innovation awards when I was secretary. We did a crowdsourcing platform and sailors or Marines could put in their ideas and people voted on it. And the best ones came up to me and I started funding them. And the first one, I think it was literally the first one, was from a chief who said, change the light bulbs on our surface ships. And you think, really? How's that going to help? Well, going to LED light bulbs from incandescent or fluorescent saves a destroyer 20,000 gallons of fuel every year. And wow. the light lasts, those LED bulbs last 7 years instead of about 6 months. Mm-hmm. And the light's better. And, if you're on a small boy, a destroyer, and the light bulbs are 40 feet above the deck, which they are in helo hangars, changing those bulbs at sea is sort of sporty. And so you really don't want to do that. And so those sorts of things, I always thought that people on the deck plates, that people in the fleet had better ideas of how we could change and how we could do better than we did. And I'll tell one more quick story. We started building hybrid ships. Thomas Friedman, the New York Times columnist, called them the Prius of the seas. But these were big deck amphibs. And the first one was the Macon Island. It had an electric engine for speeds of under 12 knots and a regular marine diesel turbine for speeds over 12 knots. The first time first deployment it went on, about a 9-month deployment, it spent less than half its fuel budget, and it stayed at sea 45 days longer than any ship it went with. And I went on the Macon Island soon after it came back, and the engineering officer said that one thing interesting had happened. He said, I've seen the statistics about how we're saving money, about how we stayed at sea longer. He said, but individual sailors became competitive on how much fuel they could save. And that they would come to him or to their chief or whoever and say, I've got an idea on this piece of equipment, how I can make it better and save money and save fuel. And that it became, the whole ship became competitive in that way. And it made them better. It made them better warfighters.
I'll ask a question that I've been trained as a lawyer originally not to ask a question that I don't know the answer to. But I'm curious, does this energy savings on those sorts of tasks actually contribute to the energy budget for our new weapon systems and allow us to advance in those as well?
Well, one of the things that is probably a flaw in our system, but when you save $1 or you save money for these sorts of things, Congress tends to have the reaction to sweep up that money, to say, thanks for saving the money, we're going to spend it on something else, instead of letting Navy or Army or the service decide where that money should go. But in your question about new weapon systems, every one of our new weapon systems has huge energy requirements. I mean, laser weapons and rail guns, and we're going to have to have far more energy, particularly electricity, on our ships because of these. I mean, the Zumwalt class destroyer is an all-electric ship, and it's made to be a platform for these weapons of the future, and even things like radar. Our new radars that we're putting on the destroyers that we're building now use so much more energy than their predecessors. Now they give us a lot more capability, but the energy needs are just tremendous. And so as you go forward, those energy needs are going to continue to go up. And if we don't figure out how to meet them in a more cost efficient and frankly better way, we're going to be in big trouble.
Well, those things all make a huge difference collectively. And I think if we can tell those stories better, we'll have an opportunity to make a difference in how we think about budgeting and how we think about what we're going to do for our strategic and tactical advantages. 45 extra days at sea is a big deal in a planning cycle, and those kinds of things, if they also save maintenance, would be a big deal. And so where else do you see the advantages of renewables and biofuels in our operations, our op tempos, or our maintenance budgets?
Well, the one requirement, or we had several requirements for biofuels, but one of them was that it be a drop-in fuel, that we weren't going to change engines, we weren't going to change settings, we weren't going to do anything. We just wanted to have them drop in. But anything that uses power, this is going to be very helpful too. And so I think that as we look at the future, and as we look at these increasing energy needs, we're gonna have to do things like this. Or, I told you about those $2 billion in unbudgeted fuel price increases because of oil and gas are worldwide commodities, and it doesn't matter that we are, that we produce enough oil and gas for our own use. The price is going to be set internationally. And, we were having to make decisions when we got that huge fuel price increase of steaming less and flying less and training less. And if the cost of fuel got too high, you were going to have to start cutting platforms. You were going to have to, because we just couldn't afford to either keep them in the air or on the sea. And that is possible in the future. I mean, right now, the price of oil is very low, but it's not just the price. It's also the price it's costing us in terms of climate change. It's also the price that it's costing us in terms of our warfighting abilities. And I'll go back to that Singapore example. Do you really want to be dependent on the Chinese to refuel our warships in the Western Pacific? I don't think so.
So let's talk a minute about renewables in our allies and where we have our naval bases. One of the places that I've read a little bit about and enjoyed being at least a little bit was Rota. And the Spanish infrastructure for wind energy is probably second to none in terms of the percentage of wind energy that they're getting across the board. I think Rota is one of the places that's benefited from that. What are we doing overseas to benefit our naval bases with renewables?
We started to look at that because places like Rota, but also places like Japan that have no fossil fuels of their own and have to import the whole thing. Places like Diego Garcia out in the middle of the Indian Ocean. I mean, not close to anything. And fuel costs 10 times as much. Our electricity costs 10 times as much because everything has to be imported using solar and wind in those places. In Djibouti, on the Horn of Africa, it's sunny every single day, every day. And so using solar there to pull us off the grid, to make us not only to save money, but also that if the grid goes down, which it does in a lot of places, including here, that we can still do our warfighting functions. But in terms of biofuels, Italy now has repurposed a regular oil refinery in Venice to produce biofuels, primarily for the military. And I was with the head of the Italian Navy when an Italian destroyer on one side and an American destroyer on the other side took fuel from an oiler using biofuels. Singapore, Korea, Chile, Japan have all been moving this way because of a lot of these imperatives that we've been talking about. And NATO is individual countries like Spain, but also NATO as a whole. And if you want to see how energy can be used as a strategic weapon, either against you or for you, the Balkans, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, are dependent on Russia for just about all of their power. And, you know, that is not a good thing for them to do. And Putin has said that, you know, and he's used that weapon against Western Europe, who gets most of their oil and gas from Russia. And he said in a statement one time, he said, even if you start using wood for your heat, you're going to have to buy it from us. Half the Russian budget comes from oil and gas. And so if you want to see how strategically our moving to alternatives and NATO moving to alternatives and Western Europe moving to alternatives can have a big, big difference in that great power competition. I mean, it is so clear right there. And it gives us a strategic advantage, it gives us a tactical advantage, but it gives us a huge economic advantage as well.
All right. So another question on great power competition. If these competitors are China mostly and Russia, how do they view climate change as a threat requiring collaboration rather than competition, excepting the Arctic?
Well, China in particular sort of goes back and forth, sometimes wanting to be cooperative, sometimes wanting to be confrontational. They sent a spy ship in 2012 to rim of the Pacific to spy on it. Our response was we invited them to come in 2014. Okay, come on, cooperate with us. You want to be a great power, accept great power responsibilities. One interesting thing is they sent 5 ships in 2014. The spy ship also came. We didn't know if they were spying on us or the Chinese ships at the time. Russia has absolutely no interest in doing this because they are so based on oil and gas. As I said, half of their government revenues comes from that. It's a state run like a kleptocracy or a mob state. I mean, so much of the corruption flows through oil and gas that not only do they not accept climate change, but they're willing to fight very hard to make sure that the world doesn't move away from fossil fuels.
There's been some discussion earlier about the Arctic thawing and the Russians claiming that as internal waters and nearby. They also have northern ports that freeze every year. Does this matter at all to that and to them in that way?
It does, because they freeze every year, but they're beginning not to. And the Russians are militarizing the northern area. They're reopening a bunch of old Soviet era bases, and they're building new ones along that, and they're putting some of their most advanced weaponry there. And the fleet goes out of a port that in right next to Norway, in northern Russia, into the Arctic Ocean there, and they are having a much easier time now getting to sea, and we were seeing, and still are, levels of Soviet, particularly submarine activities, that we hadn't seen since the Cold War. And so they are seeing this thawing and lack of ice now more and more as a strategic advantage for them. And they're weaponizing it, they are militarizing it. And we're moving in that direction too. I mean, the Marines are training in cold weather fighting, cold response, the operation we do with NATO in Norway with the Marines every year. Commandant Bob Neller, the last commandant I served with, said the Marines have got to learn to fight in cold weather. The first place our SEALs stop after they get their trident is Kodiak Island, Alaska, so that they know how to fight in cold weather. We're beginning to move in that direction, but the great power competition in the Arctic is only going to increase. China says that they are an Arctic nation. Well, they call themselves a near Arctic nation, which stretches credibility a good bit. But they are an observer to the Arctic Council, and they are building nuclear-powered icebreakers so that they can move in there. And I think that competition is only going to increase. And the United States military, particularly the Navy, has been the guarantor of open sea lanes. And if it's going to continue to provide that role and basically keep the world's economy going, we're going to have to spend a lot more time and a lot more effort and more resources in the Arctic.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation for me so far. We've got about 5 minutes left. Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about that has been sparked by any of the questions or otherwise?
Well, I mean, one of the things that always frustrated me when I was secretary was just what we've talked about a lot here, is how to get this message out, how to make this a message about national security, how to make this a message about our service members, how to make this a message about a much broader notion than just the words climate change, because climate change until recently sort of tended to be abstract. Now with the fires that you're seeing in the West, I mean, right now, half of the 20 biggest fires ever recorded are burning or were very recently. The storms that we're seeing far more hurricanes, far more typhoons, and they're really increasing in strength. You're seeing floods that are, 100-year floods that are happening every year or two now. You're seeing droughts that are chasing people away, and getting that message out that this is not a partisan issue. This is not an us versus them issue. This is something that's going to help our military. This is something that's going to help our national security. This is something that's not optional. This is something we have to do. And just by talking about things like Norfolk Naval Base is going underwater, do we really want that to happen? And it's going to cost billions and billions and billions of dollars to either adapt to it or to try to fix it. And that's, if we were spending that money instead on fighting climate change, on making sure that the carbon that we use is going down dramatically, on rejoining international agreements like the Paris Accord, and then sticking to that. But one of the things, and this will be the last thing I say, one of the things that gives me hope is that regardless of the politics, the private sector has figured this out. The companies are moving to alternative energy because it's good business. And there's a thing called the Dow Jones Sustainability Index that if your company meets sustainability goals, it can get on that index. It's beat the market for the last 7 or 8 years. So companies that pay attention to climate change, companies that pay attention to sustainability in everything, so efficiency, climate change, all sorts of sustainability, are doing better financially than ones that are not. And so regardless of what politics do, regardless of what our government says, the private sector is moving very aggressively in this way. And we've passed the tipping point there. And I think we've passed the tipping point in the military as well. You may be able to slow it down a little bit, but you're not going to stop it.
Last 2 questions from the audience, and both related to this. Do you think climate change will be a divisive or a uniting force for our allies, and on the other side of the table for their international alignments? Will this bring people together in their alliances, or will it be divisive? And the second question there related is, what would less dependence around the globe on oil due to Saudi Arabia, Russia, and other producers related to political stability, and how will that affect us?
Well, the first question, it ought to cause us to come together. It should not be divisive because we're all facing exactly the same thing. And if you're looking at our alliances, so NATO and our alliances in the Indo-Pacific, all those, it ought to bring us together because we have exactly the same imperatives. We have exactly the same problems that we're facing. In answer to the second question, I think that's one of the major reasons to get off fossil fuels. As I said before, half of Russia's budget comes from fossil fuels, from oil and gas. Taking that away from them, making that oil and gas much less valuable or not valuable at all. And the same thing with Saudi Arabia. I was ambassador to Saudi Arabia. Oil and gas should not play as large a role as it does in international affairs. I mean, the United States spends about $80 billion keeping the Straits of Hormuz open a year through our Navy, our Air Force, our Army, our Marines, and we get practically none of that fuel, but we do it because it's an international commodity. And the last thing, I'll quote a Saudi oil minister, Zaki Amani, who said, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. The Stone Age ended because we invented something better. And that's going to be the case here. We're going to leave oil and gas in the ground, and because we've invented something better.
With that, thank you very much, Secretary Mabus. I appreciate your participation today and the insights that you've shared with us, and look forward to following up with you on other things in the future. Thank you.
Me too. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ashley, do we have something on our next session? I would invite everybody to join us for our next session on Thursday, October 15th, when Lieutenant General Barno and Dr. Nora Ben-Sahal will be talking about their new book, Adaptation Under Fire, How Militaries Change in Wartime. If you haven't become familiar with their work, you can read quite a bit of it online, and they've been talking about a variety of topics, including COVID, adaptation to the circumstances that we found ourselves there, climate change and continuation of some of these things, but many, many other topics. Please join us for that, and thank you again for joining us today. Have a wonderful rest of your day.